Hello, everyone, and welcome to the very first spiritual festival of the year of Aries, where we will be studying the spirit of resurrection, the forces of restoration, and seeing that it's all about the will, then being in Aries, then we will be looking at what is the will, what is the Shambhala force, and how we can use it. But first of all, Dike reminds us that these three groups of spiritual energies, which are released at the time of the three full moons of April, May, and June, and these three work as one. So we really have to keep that in mind. So today we will be talking about the very first, the spiritual festival, Aries. And these three spiritual groups of spiritual energies have the major task of rebuilding the new and the better world. Hopefully, men will respond to that. So what are then these three different energies that are being released at these three festivals? First, the forces of restoration, which are directed by the spirit of resurrection. They are meant to restore morale and psychological health, that is, men's mental conditions, to a happier and wholesome attitude to life. At the Wesak, it's the forces of enlightenment, which are directed by the Buddha, and they inaugurate an era of right thinking in the establishment of right human relations. They intensify spiritual values and they strengthen the will to good in all lovers of humanity. And finally, at the Festival of the Christ in June, the forces of reconstruction synthesized by the Christ will bring about the rebuilding of the tangible world along the new lines, and they will precipitate what the other two groups, the forces of enlightenment and the forces of restoration, have made possible subjectively. So we have to remember that these three work as one. So then the unique opportunity which confronts the Christ as his great hour draws near is that of unifying, synthesizing, and integrating all these forces into one great potent downpouring of spiritual energy. And these involve the activities of the spirit of resurrection, the inspiration of the Buddha as he conveys the strength of Sanat Kumara, and the forces of reconstruction at the June full moon. So it's essential and absolutely crucial that we try to grasp the unity of this hierarchical effort at these three spiritual festivals. So then let us have a look at the very first one. Who is the spirit of resurrection? First of all, he is an extraplanetary being. He is a living spiritual entity, a life-giving spirit. He is a member of the council chamber at Shambhala, and he is the chosen emissary from the council chamber of Shambhala. He works temporarily under the direction of the Christ. He is the Son of righteousness who arises with healing in his wings. So we are told that the Christ directs then the spirit of resurrection to restore livingness to men's spiritual aims and life in their planning, to engender anew the vitality needed to implement the trends of the new age, to guide humanity out of the dark cave of death, isolation, and selfishness into the light of the new day, to carry this life-giving energy which counteracts death, this vision which gives incentive to life, and this hope which can restore all nations. And the forces of restoration under the spirit of resurrection's direction at the Aries full moon then will restore the will to live and the will to good, being a life-giving entity. They will restore psychological health and morale. They will reorient the human psyche in acquiring the vision which will bring about right human relations. And these forces of restoration are concerned with human vision, human integrity, and human relations as they underlie the entire problem of the brotherhood of men. They will render futile the efforts of the old order in politics, religion, and education. They will endeavor to offset two tendencies. The first one, the tendency to crystallize, to cherish that which has gone, that is the old values of competition, conflict, selfishness, etc., and power gain. They will also offset the tendency to over-fatigue and to complete collapse due to the weight of the war. Now, that was written after the Second World War. And to the physical and psychological strain under which mankind has labored for so many years. And I think that this statement can be equally applied to our modern times, as humanity's astral and physical bodies are tired, having been under constant strain during the numerous conflicts assailing them over the past century or so. The spirit of peace, the spirit of resurrection, is the opponent and the antagonist of the spirit of death. Now, physical death, we are told, takes place only when the psychological and mental vitality of the individual, of a nation, or of humanity drops below a certain level. But humanity has been responding to the processes of dying during the past 150 years. Psychologically, mankind has been ruled by selfishness. And selfishness is the potent seed of death. Material death, psychological death, and mental death. The restoration of men's mental condition to a wholesome and happier approach to life is the primary objective of the forces of restoration. These forces will bring about the emergence of the new civilization, which is definitely men's creative work. The forces of restoration are on a small scale, evoking response from the members of the new group of world servers and from disciples everywhere. And as their psychological morale stiffens and their will to live and their will to good is strengthened, an immediate effect will be felt on a larger scale. The work of the Spirit of resurrection will intensify, and he is already making its presence felt. More and more people are beginning to be forward-looking and to hope with greater conviction and courage for a better world setup. Their wishful thinking and their emotional desire are slowly giving place to a more practical attitude. And their clear thinking and their fixed determination are far more active and their plans better laid, because both their thinking and their planning are today based on facts. They are also beginning to recognize those factors and conditions that must not be restored. And DK points out that this last point is a major point for us to bear in mind. And I think that we can see that today in the world events. There are certain factors and certain conditions that men do not want restored. So the spirit of resurrection directs the forces of restoration towards humanity, who then evokes response from the new group of world servers and the disciples to stiffen their psychological morale, to strengthen their will to live and their will to good. And then hierarchy releases then the potency of the spirit of resurrection in the hearts of men everywhere. So, in short, the energy which will lead to the restoration of human aspiration, right idealism, and fixed humanitarian intention is that distributed by the forces of restoration, which were set in motion this year, that was back in after the 1945 year. At the time of the Easter full moon, under the direction of the Masters of Wisdom and the supervision of the Christ. And DK asks us at the Aries full moon, let the demand go out for the appearance of this life-giving spirit. Let it go forth with such intensity that the hierarchy will be called into active response and will immediately release the potency of the spirit in the hearts of men everywhere. So at the Aries full moon, we will be invoking the spirit of resurrection and the forces of restoration. Aries and the ray of will and power. Aries is the zodiacal sign through which the first ray of will or power reaches our planetary life. It's the will of the Father aspect, manifesting through Aries, that governs Shambhala. And Aries is the constellation through which initiating conditions will stream into our solar system. It embodies the will to create, that which will express the will to good. Ray 1 is the monadic ray of our planetary logos. His soul is on ray 2 and his personality on the third ray. So we can see how Aries really conditions Shambhala. So DK tells us that we can note here how the transmitting ray of our planetary logos is the first, his monadic being on ray 1, and hence the place which the will plays in our human evolutionary process. His transforming ray is the second, and that eventually brings transfiguration through the medium of his personality, the third ray. And in this combination, we have the reason why in the evolution of the will aspect, we have the influence of Mars and Mercury. Mars bringing conflict and the death of the form, and Mercury bringing illumination and the development of the intuition as a result of that conflict and death. New cycles of being and of consciousness are initiated by conflict. Now, this is a very important statement, well worth remembering. New cycles of being and of consciousness are initiated by conflict. We tend to shy away from conflict because it's so painful. But here, DK tells us that it's a new cycle of being and consciousness which takes place as a result of conflict. Such seems as yet to be the law of life and the governing factor in evolution. If, however, the result of this initiating, energizing will is to produce such beneficent effects of intuitive understanding and the activity of Mercury as the messenger of the gods, it can be seen how truly through conflict the will to good can be wrought out. So this is something for us to remember. And seeing that Aries governs Shambhala and transmits the ray of will, let us then explore what is that will, what is that Shambhala force. Let's have a greater understanding of that mysterious force. DK urges us to understand the use of the will, its nature, its purpose, and its relation to what we understand by human will, and therefore make the difference between the two. But the will is not as easily to understand. Now, it wasn't even for the Christ 2000 years ago. And this Shambhala force is so different that even Christ himself, we are told, was unable to express it with facility and understanding. Hence, we have the episode in Gethsemane. Now, 2000 years have gone since Gethsemane, and since Christ made his initial contact with the Shambhala force. And by this means, and on behalf of humanity, he established a relationship which, even at the close of 20 centuries, is but a thin, frail line of connecting energy. So if we don't understand much of the will, I think we're not there yet, but we need to study it regardless. So first of all, let us see what spiritual will is and what is not. So spiritual will is not determination, which is an expression of a fixed and united desire. It's not a forceful expression of intention. It's not self-will. It's not one-pointed attention. It's not whipping up and stimulating desire so that it can be transmuted into will. It's not an implacable, unshakable, immovable focusing of all energies in the need of triumph. That's self-will. That's the will of the personality. But spiritual will is totally different. It is fundamentally an expression of the law of sacrifice. And under that law, the unit recognizes responsibility and, most importantly, identifies itself with the whole. The will is that divine aspect in man which puts him en rapport with and then controlled by divine purpose, intelligently understood in time and space, and implemented by the soul as the expression of loving application. That is, the soul reveals spiritual will, and it's the soul that applies spiritual will. The will is an expression or an aspect of the law of sacrifice, because the will, as considered and understood by the initiate, is essentially that monadic essence, qualified by fixed determination, which is identified with the will or the purpose of the planetary logos. And in this connection, it's useful to remember that one of the appellations of Sanat Kumara is that of the great sacrifice. That is, he identified with the whole. And he identified with the will of the solar logos. This sacrifice was imperative in the fullest sense, owing to the ability of the planetary logos to identify himself in full consciousness with the soul in all forms of life, latent within the planetary substance. And that law of redemption is an integral aspect of the law of sacrifice. These two go hand in hand. And we are told that the cosmic Christ was crucified upon the cross of matter. And by that great sacrifice, opportunity was offered to all evolving lives in all kingdoms of nature and in all created worlds. Thus, they could progress. Now we can see that this urge to sacrifice, to lose in order eventually to gain, is the governing principle of life itself. And it just doesn't happen only on our earth and not applied only to our planetary logos. It's the governing principle that governs the cosmic deity, the solar logos, Sanat Kumara, the great sacrifice, the solar Lord, the solar angels, the Christ, all world saviors, us included, and all humanity's endeavor. And the symbol of the law of sacrifice is the love cross, rose being the color of affection, with the bird flying being the symbol of the soul, flying free in time and space. Note that the bird is above the cross. He's flying over it. Now that's an important symbol, and we will see that in the next couple of slides. He's actually flying over. That is, he's not identified with that cross of matter. So the theme of redemption is absolutely tied up in the nature of our planetary logos. It is actually hidden in the karmic responsibilities of Sanat Kumara. So much so that he decided to create our planet for strictly redemptive purposes, making him then the prototype of all world saviors. And the difference between us, man, the microcosm, and the planetary logos, the Lord of the world, the macrocosm, lies in the fact that the Lord of the world, Sanat Kumara, is not identified with a Maya which he has created. And that's what we meant by the symbol of the bird over the cross of matter. He's not identified with that Maya. And that Maya has its purpose in eventually bringing about, the Lord of the world is bringing about then the release of the prisoners of the planet. But to that Maya, he is totally and supremely indifferent. And that parallels Christ's teaching to his disciples in be in the world, but not of the world. So too, this is what we're meant to be doing. As disciples, we move in the world of Maya, free from all illusion, unhindered by glamour, and uncontrolled by the Mayavic forces. The disciple is rapidly arriving, as far as his own little world is concerned, at that very same divine indifference which characterizes Sanat Kumara, the Lord of the world, and therefore increasingly becomes aware of the plan as it exists in the universal mind and the purpose which motivates the will of God. And in our triangle of synthesis meditation, we note the wording in the second invocation that DK gave in 1944 during World War II, which was suited to the conditions of war. We are told that it was an invocation intended to evoke the forces of life, that is, the forces at Shambhala, and invoking the Christ, the rider from the secret place, to come forth and save. So we can see that theme of redemption through this invocation. So they are to save humanity from the grip of evil through the spiritual power of the greatest Savior, our Logos, and the three Lords of liberation at Shambhala, and through the Christ. As we know, Sanat Kumara is the prototype of all world saviors. So we see that theme really running through the theme of redemption, of redeeming, salvation, running through the second invocation. So in short, the will of the planetary logos, aligned with that of the solar logos, is an expression of the law of sacrifice and concerns itself with a theme of redemption. It's a matter of consciousness related to what it's identified with, the form or the soul or spirit. So hence the secret of our logos, because he's not identified with a form. And this stance is reflected in the fourth law of esoteric healing, where DK says that the art of the healer is concerned with a lifting of the downward focused eyes onto the soul, the true healer within the form. So this is what we are being urged to do as healers, not only for ourselves to lift our eyes to the soul or to the spirit, but this is exactly also what we do to our patients. We try to lift the eyes of the personality away from itself and onto the soul and its values. So then what is the nature of the will? Very important statement here, which hopefully will shed light on that mysterious power. The secret of the will lies in the recognition of the divine nature of man. Only this can evoke the true expression of the will. It has, in fact, to be evoked by the soul, as it dominates the human mind and controls the personality. The secret of the will is also closely tied up with the recognition of the unconquerable nature of goodness and the inevitability of the ultimate triumph of good. So seeing the love aspect in every human being, the goodness in every human being, which is the inherent nature of the soul in every human being and in everything, not just every human being. And these, then hence we see the powerful words of the mantra given by DK, which we say in our regular triangle of synthesis meditation. The power of the spirit of man shall triumph. And the power of that spirit of man through the forces of light, or rather the forces of light through man, do control the forces of evil. So ultimately, good will triumph or does triumph. We are told also that this Shambhala force is a unifying, synthetic force. In its true expression, the will today is needed as a propelling, because Ray 1, motion is a forward motion. So it propels people. It's an initiating force. It's an expulsive force. Now that's a very important word, which we will see in the next couple of slides. And also a clarifying, a purifying agent. And we saw in our studies of the third eye and the nature of the soul that the third eye has a destructive aspect, and the energy flowing through the third eye has a disintegrating and destroying effect. It can, through its focused attention, directed by the intelligent will, drive out physical matter. Then it's the agent of the soul in its work of purification. So it's that third work of the soul which is touched here. The destructive work of getting rid of all forms, of shaking out of the body's matter of undesirable nature, and of breaking down the barriers and the limitations to true soul activity. And if you remember in our study of the soul, the nature of the soul was Atma Buddhi, will, love. So it's that aspect of the soul that DK is referring here to. There are three great energies focused in Shambhala. the seat of fire. It's the energy of purification, the energy of destruction. This is what we've been referring to, that expulsive fire. And thirdly, the energy of organization, which we can see in the Aries rays, ray 1 and ray 7. We can see that here, how then Aries influences the energies at Shambhala. Let's take one at a time. The energy of purification first. This is the power innate in the manifested universe, which gradually and steadily adapts the substance matter to the spiritual by a process called purification, where humanity is concerned. It involves the elimination of that which hinders the nature of divinity from full expression. And this, again, from inherent or latent capacity. Now, this necessitates the leaving behind, stage by stage, cycle after cycle, life after life, and plane after plane, that is, different levels of consciousness, of every tendency in the form nature which veils or hides the glory of God. That is the soul, and then eventually the spirit. It is essentially the energy which substitutes good for evil. But unfortunately, man has distorted that principle of purification and has related it mainly to physical phenomena, such as enforced celibacy or rigid vegetarianism, where then the thoughts of the aspirants become focused downwards into matter, but not outwards and upwards into light. Again, it's a matter of identification. This great energy of purification, that ray 1, is regenerating humanity. And of this, the widespread fires, which have been such an outstanding characteristic of the war, the first and the second, and still now the war going on, in the various conflicts in the war and the wars going on in the world today, are the outward and visible sign. Much evil is being burnt out through the revelation of the appalling character of that evil. And through this, unity is being produced. Second, the energy of destruction. This is a destruction which removes the forms that are imprisoning the inner spiritual life and hiding the inner soul light. It's the destroying aspect of life itself, just as there is a destructive agency in matter itself. Now we are told that this is not destruction of forms by force, such as is now being imposed on the world, but it's a destruction brought about by the greatly strengthened life within the form. That is, it's strengthened, sorry about the mistake here, it's the strengthened life energy of the jewel within the group, the egoic lotus of our group soul. So it's that woody aspect which is being expressed, which is being distributed. and it expresses itself through harmony and unity. It produces necessarily understanding. It promotes goodwill and eventually ends the separative and isolating tendencies of mankind. And on a smaller scale, the healer also works with the energy of that jewel. We know from our studies of esoteric healing that the healer works entirely with a life aspect. The perfect healer, something that's non-existent at the moment, works through the closed and sealed point within the center, that is, with that Buddhic point right at the center of our egoic lotus. There the point of life is to be found. Monadic relation, as it becomes established, lets loose then the destructive aspect of the basic energy, and all the hindrances are destroyed with expedition. And we know that from our study of esoteric healing. The power of the soul through the third eye is destructive. That is, it just removes all the hindrances that are in the way of the flow of soul energy. Now, this is also true of humanity as a whole, not just the individual. Now, on a wider scale, the destructive activity is set in motion through the will of those who constitute the council at Shambhala. And under cyclic law, this destructive energy comes into play and destroys the forms of life, which prevents divine expression. And here Decay referred to these ideologies. Well, we know now how some of these ideologies that are very good in theory, but when it's applied, it involves...
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
It involves coercion, cruelty, and disregard for life. So this will is brought into activity through the determination of humanity itself. Which under the law of karma makes man the master of his own destiny, leading him to initiate those causes that are responsible for the cyclic events and consequences in human affairs. But the energy of destruction liberates the soul or the spirit of man. Through all these conflicts, through all these wars, men have seen, and in that sight will never be forgotten. And the horror thus engendered will aid in stiffening the will of humanity to betterment. So that energy of destruction helps humanity to shape that will on the right lines, on the lines of the soul values. So the energy of destruction has its side of beauty when the spiritual values are grasped. That which has so grossly imprisoned the human spirit is disappearing. The rocky grave of humanity is breaking open and releasing men to a life of resurrection. And Decay asks us to ponder upon the destructive purpose of God a purpose which is motivated by love, guided by a balanced judgment as to form, and which cherishes and fosters the life and its resultant spiritual values. And the third one is now he's referring to the solar creation, the will of organization sets in motion the activity of the great ray lives and started the motivation and impulse of that which produced manifestation. Thus were the 7 ray qualities brought into expression. Hence our solar system was created. The relation of spirit and matter produced this ordered process, which again, psychically and under law, creates the manifested world. Now here's an important statement. Creates the manifested world as a field for soul development. As a field for soul development. And as an area wherein divine purpose is wrought out through the medium of the plan. Then it will be for humanity then to precipitate and to stabilize the appearing good. And this they will learn to do through the utilization of the 3rd Shambhala energy, the energy of organization. The new world will be built upon the ruins of the old. The new structure will rise. Men of goodwill everywhere, under the guidance of the new group of world servers, will organize themselves into battalions of life. I love that expression. Will organize themselves into battalions of life. And their first major task will be the development of right human relations through the education of the masses. Now it's important for us to distinguish the difference between desire and will, because that can be a bit confusing. Desire is not, from the angle of reality, a subjective quality, except insofar as it is a distortion or the glamorous use of the energy of will. So this desire, therefore, is a distortion of the use of the energy of will. Desire is the force of the form nature, that is from the 6th astral plane, which is the plane of desire. Whereas will is the energy of the soul, expressing itself as direction, progress, and conformity to the plan. This plan, from the standpoint of the individual, is as much of the sense will of the God as he can. At any particular stage in his experience, he can grasp and understand. So these distinctions are really important for us to keep in mind. Desire is really from the 6th astral plane. It's a distortion of the will, whereas the will is the energy of the soul. Atma Buddhi. Now, the evocation of the energy of the will and its effect upon the unprepared, materialistically minded person might and would prove a disaster. It would simply serve to focus and strengthen the lower self-will. And this is exactly what's happening today. With all the Shambhala impacts that we have had in the 20th century, this has strengthened and has stimulated the self-will of the personalities, whether it's in the home or in politics or in religion or in organizations. It has strengthened this personality self-will. But hierarchy and Shambhala, they are confident that the good will triumph, that the spirit of man will triumph. And this is why the Shambhala impact have been allowed in the world. It causes temporary conflict, temporary disruption, but in the long run, it will bring out the good in men. It could then create such a driving force directed to selfish ends that the person might become a monster of wickedness, and that we know that from world events. And one such figure in ancient times was Nero, but the modern example is Hitler. Desire is as yet, unfortunately, the strongest force in the world. Organized, unified desire. Note the words, organized, unified desire was the basic reason for the appalling early successes of the Axis powers. If only the forces of light and all the disciples and humanity would gather in a greater organization as one, Dickey says, we will triumph basically overnight. But we're not organized yet to the point that that can occur. So eventually, however, there comes a life wherein the disciple is confronted by both the dweller and the angel simultaneously, and the major conflict of his experience takes place. So is today in the world. The spiritual and the material are in conflict, and humanity itself is the battleground. The forces of evil are those intelligent, evil, unloving, hateful individualities who are to the world of selfish and material focus what the hierarchy of masters working under the Christ are to struggling human aspirants. The power of these evil forces is enormous, for they recognize no restrictions or ordinary, decent human limitations. They work through violence, coercion, cruelty, hate, terror, and lies. They aim to subjugate the human consciousness through complete control of men's minds, through the withholding of the good and the promulgation of evil. They stimulate the brains of men through the extent of their evil and magical knowledge. And DK says, I mean this literally and physically. And there are two great handicaps to the free expression of the Shambhala force in its true nature. The first one is the sensitivity of the lower nature to its impact. And of course, the lower nature distorts it, as we saw earlier on. And its consequent prostitution to selfish ends. As in the case, and here he was talking about the negative, which was the sensitive, receptive attitude of the German people, and its use by the Axis nations for material objectives. And the second is the blocking, hindering, muddled, but massed opposition of the well-meaning people of the world who talk vaguely and beautifully about love, but refuse to consider the techniques of the will of God in operation. They will not believe that this will could possibly express itself through the destruction of evil with all the material consequences of that evil. They cannot believe that a God of love could possibly employ the first divine aspect to destroy the forms which are obstructing the free play of divine spirit. So therefore, how to combat evil? And DK says to us, there is only one way in which this focused evil will, which is responsive to the Shambhala force, can be overcome. And that is by the opposition of an equally focused spiritual will, organized, I would say, and unified. Spiritual will displayed by responsive men and women of goodwill who can train themselves to be sensitive to this type of new incoming energy and can learn how to invoke and evoke it. Very important statement, friends, for us to remember. Only the will to good will suffice to blot out and annihilate the will to evil. The arousing of men of goodwill in every nation, men who see humanity as a whole and all men as brothers, is the only way in which this rising tide of hate can be stemmed. Even a little grasp and understanding of it, meaning understanding of the spiritual will, would aid humanity to drive evil, whether it's individual, group, or planetary, back to the place from whence it came, and would aid in the release of humanity from the terror which is today stalking abroad, defying God and man. So desire works from and through the material form upwards. It is invocative, but when masked and focused, it can evoke will, whereas desire works downwards into form, bending form consciously to divine purpose. It is evocative, that is, the response from the higher powers. So when evoked, it ends desire and becomes an immanent, propulsive, driving force, stabilizing, clarifying, and amongst other things, finally destroying what is in its way that prevents the flow of spirit or the soul. Now we are told it is much more than this, but this is all that men can grasp at this time, and all for which he has as yet the mechanism of comprehension. That is, the lower mind is not yet developed to be able to grasp the real, the true nature of will. It is this will, aroused by invocation, which must be focused in the light of the soul and dedicated to the purposes of light and for the purpose of establishing right human relations, which must be used in love to destroy all that is hindering the free flow of human life, and that is bringing death, spiritual and real, to humanity. Now, this will must be invoked and evoked. And DK here says, I'm referring to the focused consciousness of the men and women of goodwill, whose lives are conditioned by the will to carry forward the purposes of God in love, who seek selflessly to understand those purposes and who are fearless of death. That is, those who identify with their spirit or their soul. So DK says, you can consequently see why there was more than the casual use of the current word in my mind when the terms goodwill or the will to good were discussed. All the time I had in my thoughts not just kindness and good intention, but the focused will to good, which can and must evoke the Shambhala energy and use it for the arresting of the forces of evil. The Shambhala force is nevertheless available for right usage, but the power to express it lies in its understanding. And this is what we've been trying to do. As far as may be possible at this midway point in human evolution. And its group use. Note these words, group use. May I repeat those two key words, says DK, to the use of the Shambhala energy. Group use and understanding. And I would here like to point out that the will aspect can be contacted only from the mental plane, and only those, therefore, who are working with and through the mind can begin to appropriate this energy. In other words, the soul. Those who seek to evoke the Shambhala force are approaching close to the energy of fire. Fire is a symbol in the quality of the mental plane, and fire is an aspect of the divine nature. So fiery goodwill, and the conscious, focused use of the Shambhala force can counter fire by fire. And this must be done. How do we do that? Initiated thinking, or thinking as the initiate. One of the lines of thinking which is most necessary to impress on advancing disciples is that of initiated thinking. That is, thinking as the initiate, thinking as the soul. This means thought carried forward on purely abstract levels up here, embodying therefore thought which is free from soul conditioning or from the crystallization of the lower minds. It is essentially triadal thinking. So it's the soul that will reveal the triadal energies. And it's only registered by the brain when the antakarana is somewhat constructed and there is some direct communication from the spiritual triad to the brain of the personality. So we need to invoke the soul, think as the soul, and as the soul, then we invoke the triad. The soul reveals the triad. So how should we act if we haven't reached the level of an initiate? Well, DK gives the very simple technique of as if, where the disciple acts as if he were an initiate, and then discovers that as the man thinks in his heart, so is he. Because the heart is the custodian of the power of the imagination. The imagination is released into creative activity when the disciple acts as if he were the soul in full expression, as if the master were ever aware of the doings of his disciple, as if he walked in full liberation consciously, as if he was an initiate. So desire, when masked and focused, can invoke the will. Will, when evoked, ends desire and becomes an immanent, propulsive, driving force, stabilizing, clarifying, and amongst other things, finally destroying. It is this will aroused by invocation which must be focused in the light of the soul and dedicated to the purposes of light and for the purposes of establishing right human relations, which must be used in love to destroy all that is hindering the free flow of human life and that is bringing death, spiritual and real, to humanity. And DK emphasizes this will must be invoked and evoked. And DK's calling for groups to be organized who can take this subject as the theme of their meditation and who would try to fit them by right understanding to contact and use the Shambhala energy. Would it not be possible gradually to elaborate this theme of the revelation of the divine will so that the general subject may be ready for presentation to the thinking public when peace truly comes? And this is a meditation that DK has suggested to foster the will to good in externalization of hierarchy, where he says the major need today for each and all who must sponsor the work of the future that I'm seeking to do with your cooperation and understanding is to foster the growth of the will to love and work. The effort on your part will express itself in a steadily deepening love for humanity, for all men and for each other. It will demonstrate in a constant effort to invoke the spiritual will in self-discipline and persistence. I would ask all of you who associate yourselves with me in the work of the future each day to use the very brief meditation which I outlined below. And I would ask you also to read and reread the instructions given to you on avatars. And this is the meditation that we do every day. Our little community offers a short, dynamic, and affirmative guided visualization of the meditation DK gave in externalization that he referred to in the first slide, in the previous slide, which has been adapted to incorporate the invocation of these great spiritual beings as he suggested in Reappearance of the Christ, and as well as the technique of the superimposition of triangles as he advised in Rule 2 in Esoteric Healing. Friends, you're very welcome to join us every day on Zoom at 8:30 p.m. GMT. Or we have also additional sessions for those who can't attend because of the time difference on Fridays at 11 p.m. GMT, Sundays at 11 a.m., GMT, and we use the same link. Or if you can't participate for whatever reason at the scheduled times, you can still do that very short and affirmative meditation on your own every day. You will be greatly helping hierarchy and humanity to arrest evil in the world. So if in doubt, please visit the calendar on our website or send us an email at MF Esoteric Healing Community. And the recordings of this guided visualization of the triangle of synthesis meditation that we called it are also available on our website if you want to meditate on your own because of whatever reason that you can't join us. So nearly there, friends. The ray of will and power flows through Aries, Leo, and Capricorn in our solar system. It is the creative will which initiates manifestation, as we saw earlier on. It conditions that which is created because it brings life. It brings about eventual fulfillment because it is a propelling energy, because it pushes us, it moves us forward towards new states of being and new states of consciousness. And it overcomes death and differentiation because then we start thinking as the soul, which for the soul, being on earth down here is death. Whereas being on the inner plane is liberation. So Aries is the sign of beginnings, the beginning of the creative process, the first step of the soul into incarnation, the beginning and recurring and constant cycles of experience, so that the soul can evolve, can unfold. The beginning of the period wherein the soul changes its direction, its purpose, its method, and finally enters upon that definite, defined process, which we call spiritual regeneration and initiation. Because Aries is the sign that initiates things, that starts things up. So all initiates must and eventually do express that dynamic, creative will, a focused purpose which expresses only the will to good, and also that sustained effort through will, which brings fulfillment. I would remind you here that sustained effort is the seed of synthesis, the cause of achievement, and that which eventually overcomes death, because death and limitation are synonymous terms. So, in conclusion, quick summary of the Shambhala force. It is a unifying synthetic force. It is a propelling, expulsive force. It is a clarifying, purifying agent. It's related to the livingness because it brings life, regeneration, as we saw earlier on. It concerns the establishing of right human relations, the will to good. And it's the condition of being which eventually negates the power of death. That is, we start the new state of being that is, as an initiate, thinking as the soul, where limitation is death, and Aries releases the soul into the inner plane, a new state of being. In conclusion, the center where the will of God is known, that is Shambhala, where the will of God originates. And the will to good is essential love. Thank you, friends, for joining us today for this very first spiritual festival of 2025, a momentous year for all of us, the forerunners. And we are meant to be bringing these energies to the fore to liberate humanity. So friends, please join us in our triangle of synthesis. Let's make an organized and unified group with strengthened will and the will to good for the benefit of humanity as a group. And we are meant to start straight away in our triangle of synthesis, which we have, as I said to you, every day, but today we've gone a little bit longer, so we will be doing it straight away. So you're very welcome to join us if you like. Thank you, friends.